What happened at Watergate?
Watergate is a complex of upscale apartment and office buildings in Washington, D.C. In July 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic Party's national headquarters there. Among these men was James McCord Jr. 1924, the security coordinator of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, CRP. McCord was among those working to get President Richard Nixon. 1913 to 1994, a Republican, elected to a second term in office. All 5 men who were caught in the break-in were indicted on charges of burglary and wiretapping, as were CRP AG Gordon Liddy, 1930, and White House consultant E. Howard Hunt. 1918. 5 of the men pleaded guilty to the charges. McCord and Liddy were tried and found guilty. In February 1972, 5 months before the break-in at Watergate, President Nixon had traveled to China, becoming the first U.S. president to visit that country. In May he traveled to Moscow, where he signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I Treaty, the first such treaty between the United States and the USSR. When the election was held in November, Nixon won in a landslide victory over the Democratic candidate George McGovern, 1922 to 1998. But early in Nixon's second term, which began in 1973, the Watergate affair became a full-blown political scandal when convicted burglar James McCord wrote a letter to District Court Judge John Sirica. 1904 to 1992, charging a massive cover-up in the Watergate break-in. A special Senate committee began televised investigations into the affair. Before it was all over, about 40 people, including high-level government officials, had been charged with crimes including burglary, wiretapping of citizens, violating campaign finance laws by accepting contributions in exchange for political favors, the use of government agencies to harm political opponents, and sabotage. Among those prosecuted were John Dean, 1938, former White House counsel, and Attorney General John Mitchell, 1913 to 1988. It was revealed that members of the Nixon administration had known about the Watergate burglary. It was also discovered that the president had taped conversations in the Oval Office. When Dean and Mitchell were convicted, public confidence in President Nixon plummeted. In July 1974, the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives was preparing articles of impeachment, including one that charged the president with obstruction of justice, against the president. The impeachment proceedings would not make it as far as the Senate. Nixon chose to resign on August 9, 1974. He was the first and so far only U.S. president to resign from office. Shortly after taking office, Nixon's successor, Gerald R. Ford, 1913, pardoned Nixon. But Watergate remains a dark chapter in the nation's history.
Why was President Clinton impeached?
Some believe the proceedings were nothing more than a vast right-wing conspiracy. A term coined by First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, 1947, early in 1998. Still, others including enough members of the U.S. House of Representatives to bring 11 counts of impeachment against President Clinton. In December 1998 felt the nation's chief had perjured himself and obstructed justice. Many also believed he had jeopardized the authority of the U.S. presidency. Accused of having an affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky, President Clinton vehemently denied it. Upon continued investigation, conducted by Special Prosecutor Kenneth Starr's office, the allegations proved to be true. Since the president had been so adamant in his statements to the contrary, evidence began to accumulate that he had lied about his relationship with the young woman and that he had tried to cover up the matter. Many believed the charges against Clinton did not constitute the high crimes and misdemeanors called for by the U.S. Constitution to remove a president from office. Nevertheless, in January 1999 the U.S. Senate organized itself to hear the charges against the president. When the trial concluded in February, Clinton was acquitted of both perjury and obstruction of justice. He served out his second term and left office with high approval ratings. Despite being the subject of the longest criminal investigation of a president in history, the Clinton impeachment was the first time the federal legislature had convened itself as a court in more than 130 years since the impeachment hearings of President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, in 1868.
What rights are protected in the Bill of Rights?
The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution are collectively called the Bill of Rights, which became law on December 15, 1791, and are meant to guarantee individual liberties. The First Amendment, which is perhaps most often cited by Americans, guarantees freedom of religion, speech, and the press, as well as the right to assemble peaceably and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms, stating that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The Third Amendment forbids peacetime quartering of soldiers in private dwellings without consent of the owner. The Fourth Amendment forbids unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth through the Seventh Amendments establish basic standards of jurisprudence. The Fifth, which long ago fell into common usage with the phrase, "he's pleading the Fifth," guarantees that a person will not be compelled to testify against himself. The amendment also ensures that a criminal indictment can only be handed down by a grand jury. 12 to 23 people who determine if a trial is necessary, and prohibits double jeopardy, being prosecuted twice for the same criminal offense. The Sixth Amendment protects the rights of accused persons in criminal cases by guaranteeing a speedy and fair trial, an impartial jury, and the right to counsel. The Seventh Amendment guarantees trial by jury. The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment, which is one that many Americans are probably unable to cite, is an important one nevertheless. It states that simply because a right is not enumerated in the Constitution, it does not mean that the people do not retain that right. The 10th Amendment relinquishes to the state governments those powers the Constitution did not expressly grant the federal government or deny the states. In other words, it limits the power of the federal government to that which is granted in the Constitution.
How did the Democratic Party begin?
The other and older principal party in the United States today, the Democratic Party, was founded around electing Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, to office in 1800, against Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party. The party's platform favored personal liberty and the limitation of federal government. Installing Jefferson in office, the party then called the Democratic Republicans went on to get its candidates into the White House for the next 25 years. In 1828 they became known simply as Democrats, dropping the suffix. Depending on how one counts, there have been either 18 or 19 Democratic presidents. Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, is problematic since he was a Democrat before joining the National Union Party ticket as the vice presidential candidate in 1864. Some sources list both party affiliations, as in Democratic/National Union.
When was the U.S. Constitution ratified?
The Constitution was ratified by the required 9 states by June 21, 1788. It went into effect the following year, superseding the Articles of Confederation, 1781.
Why is the Kennedy presidency called Camelot?
The term was actually assigned by Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, 1929 to 1994. Shortly after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, November 22, 1963. The former First Lady was talking with a journalist when she described her husband's presidency as an American Camelot. And she asked that his memory be preserved. Camelot refers, of course, to the time of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and has come to refer to a place or time of idyllic happiness. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's widow, who had with fortitude and grace guided her family and the country through the sorrow and anguish of the president's funeral, quite naturally held sway over the American public. So when she suggested that the shining moments of her husband's presidency were reminiscent of the legends of Camelot, journalists picked up on it. Despite subsequent revelations that there were difficulties in the Kennedy marriage, public opinion polls indicate that the image of Camelot, albeit somewhat tarnished, has prevailed.
How did the Aztec and Inca empires compare with the Mayan?
While all were advanced civilizations that were eventually conquered by Spaniards, the Inca and Aztec cultures reached their peaks in the 15th century, just before the arrival of the Europeans in the New World. The Mayan civilization reached its zenith about 500 years earlier, and was already in decline by the time of European incursion. Each group also occupied a different region of the Americas, where each carved out its own stronghold and flourished. The Aztecs settled in central Mexico, the Incas in western South America, primarily Peru, and the Mayas in the Yucatan Peninsula and Central America. There is evidence that they traded with each other as well as with American Indians to the north. The Aztecs founded their central city of Tenochtitlan, the site of Mexico City, about 1325. A poor nomadic people before their arrival in Mexico's central region. The Aztecs believed the Lake Texcoco marsh was a prophetic place to settle. Before they built it into a great city, they first had to fill in the swampy area, which they did by creating artificial islands. In the 1500s, when the Spanish first saw the remarkable city with its system of causeways, canals, bridges, and aqueducts, they called it the Venice of the New World. In addition to constructing the impressive trade and cultural center of Tenochtitlan, the Aztecs were farmers, astronomers, mathematicians, and historians who recorded the events of their civilization. Their religion was pantheistic, meaning they worshipped many gods. Given that, it's not surprising that when the Spanish conquistadors arrived, at first the Maya believed they were gods, or at least the heavenly hosts of their long-awaited god Quetzalcoatl, and even welcomed them with gifts. Later, the Aztec rose up against the Europeans, but under the leadership of Hernán Cortés. 1485 to 1547, the Spaniards conquered the group, claiming Mexico in August 1521. The Incas developed one of the most extensive empires in all the Americas. During the 100 years before the arrival of the Europeans, the Incas expanded their territory along the western coast of South America to include parts of present-day Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Though it was a vast region, it was nevertheless a closely knit state ruled by a powerful emperor. The government was subdivided down to the local level. But because the emperor required total obedience from his subjects, local rulers were kept in check. Like the Aztecs in Mexico, the Inca developed an infrastructure that included a network of roads, bridges, and ferries as well as irrigation systems. They 2. Built impressive edifices, demonstrating their abilities as engineers. The magnificent city of Machu Picchu was modeled in clay before construction began. The Inca were also skilled craftspeople, working with gold, silver, and textiles. Like the Aztecs, the Incas worshipped many gods. And when the Spanish explorer Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475–1541, arrived in the region in 1532, he was welcomed as a god at first. However, by 1537 the Inca were brought under Spanish control.
Who were the Know-Nothings?
The Know-Nothings were members of A.U.'s political movement during the mid-1800s, Americans who feared the foreign influence of immigrants. There was an influx of new arrivals in the 1840s, banded together. Sometimes in secret societies, in order to uphold what they believed to be the American view. When people who were thought to be members of these groups were asked about their views and activities, the typical response was, "I don't know," which gave the movement its name. The Know-Nothings worked to elect only Native Americans, U.S. born citizens, to political office. And they advocated the requirement for citizenship be 25 years of residence in the United States. Since many immigrants came from European countries and were Roman Catholics, the Know-Nothings also opposed the Catholic Church. In 1843 Know-Nothings formed the American Republican Party. By 1854 they had allied themselves with factions within the Whig Party and in the state elections held that year. Know-Nothings swept the vote in Massachusetts and Delaware, nearly carried New York and Pennsylvania, and pulled substantial votes in the South. The following year, the Know-Nothings dropped much of their secrecy and became known simply as the American Party. It was the issue of slavery that finally split the party in the national election of 1856. And the group dissolved after that. Anti-slavery members of the American Party joined the newly formed Republican Party.
How was the United Nations formed?
Officially, the United Nations, UN, was not formed until October 1945. However, events during World War II, 1939–45, had paved the way for the founding of the International peacekeeping organization that today is so familiar to people around the globe. Fervent German nationalist Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, and his troops invaded Poland in 1939. And soon Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe. Leaders of 9 nations: Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Yugoslavia met with Britain and its Commonwealth states in London. There, on June 12, 1941, the countries signed the Inter-Allied Declaration. vowing to work together for a free world. 2 months later, on August 14, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt 1882 to 1945, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill 1874 to 1965, signed the Atlantic Charter. In it the two leaders outlined their aims for peace. On January 1, 1942, the declaration by the United Nations was signed by 26 countries who pledged to work together to fight the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they agreed not to make peace separately. The term United Nations, otherwise known as the UN, is believed to have originated with Roosevelt. In late November and early December 1943, the Big Three Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953, met in Tehran, Iran, for the first time during the war. There these Allied nations leaders cited the responsibility of a United Nations organization in keeping the peace once the war was over. Though ending the war was first and foremost in the minds of these leaders. All had seen 2 world wars fought in close succession and were determined that the nations of the world could work together to prevent such an event from happening again. In August 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C., representatives of Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China met to make plans for the peacekeeping organization that had been envisioned. The outcome of that meeting, which lasted into October, was the basic concept for the UN Security Council as we know it, with the world's 5 major powers having permanent seats on the council and a limited and rotating membership beyond that. When the Big Three met again at the Yalta Conference, in the Soviet Union, in February 1945, they discussed matters that were central to ending the fighting with Germany and with Japan. But Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin also announced that a conference of the United Nations would open in San Francisco on April 25 of that year. Having directed the United States' massive war effort, Roosevelt did not live to see the end of World War II or the creation of the international peacekeeping body. Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12, 1945. The war in Europe ended May 7. And during the closing days of World War II, the UN was chartered. The representatives of the Allied nations met as promised in San Francisco. On June 26, 1945, the governing treaty was signed by the delegates. On October 24, 1945, shortly after the war ended with Japan, the United Nations officially came into existence when the required number of nations approved the charter. 50 nations were members of the UN at the outset. Today the membership numbers 191.
What is the Byzantine Empire's role in history?
The Byzantine Empire, 330 or 395-1453, is considered a link between ancient and modern civilizations. Though the empire was constantly fighting off invaders, plagued by religious controversies, and marred by political strife. As the heir of the Roman world, it allowed for the customs of Greco-Roman civilization to mix with those of the East and with Christianity. The fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 typically marks the beginning of the modern era.
Are the Bushes the first father-son presidents?
No, the nation's 41st, George H. W. Bush, and 43rd, George W. Bush, presidents were preceded as father-son presidents by John Adams. 1735 to 1826, the second President of the United States, and John Quincy Adams, 1767 to 1848, the sixth. There have been other presidents whose relatives held the office before them. Benjamin Harrison. The 23rd president was the grandson of the nation's ninth, William Henry Harrison. Zachary Taylor, the 12th president, and James Madison, the 4th, were second cousins. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was preceded in the office by his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. Genealogists determined that FDR had ties to 10 other presidents as well. 4 of them were blood relatives and 6 were relatives by marriage: John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, William Henry Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, James Madison. William Howard Taft, Zachary Taylor, Martin Van Buren, and George Washington.
What was the Abu Ghraib prison scandal?
News of the atrocities of Abu Ghraib, where Iraqi prisoners were being held by members of the U.S. military during Operation Iraqi Freedom, first surfaced in April 2004 when shocking photographs began appearing in the American media. The photos depicted an array of hideous abuses, all of them in violation of the Geneva Conventions for the treatment of prisoners of war. The deep troubles first surfaced in spring 2003 when International Red Cross and human rights groups complained that American troops had been mistreating Iraqi prisoners. The U.S. Army launched an investigation into its prison system. A fact-finding mission was eventually led by Major General Antonio Taguba, who completed his report in February 2004. It stated that one police company at Abu Ghraib had committed sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses. The Taguba report also found that supervisory omission was rampant at the prison. More investigations and reports followed, taking into account other prisons under central command. Some of the reports tied prisoner deaths to the abuses. The scandal sent shockwaves around the world and sparked an intense debate about how such abuses could have happened. The tortures were labeled by some as unauthorized actions taken by a few individuals, but others believed they were a manifestation of policy that had gone wrong. The scandal soon widened, By May 2004, British newspapers began reporting abuses by British troops. While Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953, apologized for any mistreatment Iraqi prisoners may have suffered at the hands of British troops. President Bush went on Arabic television to denounce the abuses as abhorrent. He stopped short of an apology, saying that the mistreatment does not represent the America that I know. Both nations moved quickly to bring charges against several soldiers shown in the pictures. The guilty verdicts, and subsequent sentences, began being handed down in May 2004. The prison scandals fueled criticism of the controversial war in Iraq. They also prompted a deadly backlash from the Arab world. Insurgents in Iraq began a series of kidnappings of Americans and British citizens working in Iraq, most of them ending in ghastly and widely publicized killings. Between spring 2004 and spring 2005, more than 200 foreigners were taken captive in Iraq. More than 30 of them were killed by their kidnappers.
How did the Republican Party begin?
The Republican Party, one of the two principal political parties of the United States, was founded in 1854 by those opposing the extension of slavery into new territories. The party mustered enough support to elect their candidate in 1860, Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865. During the 1880s, party members nicknamed themselves the Grand Old Party. The vestige of this nickname is still around today, as the GOP. There have been 17 Republican presidents.
What were the gulags?
Gulags were prisons for political dissidents in the Soviet Union. The prisons existed from 1919 into the 1950s. Gulag is an abbreviation of the Russian name of the system. Globnoye upravilnye ispravitelno trudovik lagary, which translates to Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps. The camps were first used during the collectivization of agriculture in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Under Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's 1879–1953 purges of the 1930s, anyone who posed or seemed to pose a threat to his hard-line communist regime was rounded up and sent to a gulag. During World War II, 1939–45, prisoners of war were held in the gulags. And after the war, Stalin continued to use the camps to punish those who opposed him. Though exact figures are unknown, it is believed that as many as 30 million people were imprisoned in gulags, where they faced forced labor, grueling conditions, and maltreatment including starvation. Official Soviet figures place the number around 10 million. Millions are believed to have died in the gulags. After Stalin died in 1953, the system was dismantled, with some of the prisoners receiving amnesty.
What was the first national government?
It is believed to have been that of the first Egyptian king, Menes, who united Upper and Lower Egypt in 3110 B.C. and founded a central government at Memphis, near present-day Cairo. Ruling for 62 years, Menes established the first of what would eventually number 30 dynasties that ruled ancient Egypt for nearly 3,000 years until 332 BC. By the time the third dynasty began around 2700 BC, the central government was well established, and strong subjects believed their kings and queens to be half human and half god. The pharaohs lived in magnificent luxury. Palaces and temples were built for them and were filled with exotic goods from other lands. These treasures were even buried with the pharaohs in order to be enjoyed in the afterworld. It was during the Third Dynasty that the 500-year period known as the Old Kingdom or the Pyramid Age began. It would become the period that saw the building of gigantic pyramids for Egypt's kings.
Why do historians draw comparisons among Stalin, Hitler, Napoleon, and Alexander the Great?
All four men were fiercely powerful and seemingly indomitable leaders. And their early lives and careers shared some interesting characteristics as well. First, none of them were native sons of the countries they ended up ruling, and some would say, defining. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, was born in Georgia. German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, in Austria. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, in Corsica, which, though technically a new possession of France, was decidedly more Italian in nature. And King of the Macedonians Alexander the Great, 356–323 BC, was from the fringe city-state of Macedonia. Yet it was, respectively, Russian, German, French, and Greek culture that each leader spread. All four men rose to power through the military, or, in Alexander's case, who succeeded his father, after having carried out military strategy. Once installed as rulers, all led fantastic military campaigns to expand their spheres of influence. The wars brought on by their nationalism left millions dead. Finally, all four men inspired, and some would say continue to inspire, terror in the human soul. Still, history has been more forgiving of both Alexander and Napoleon, who today seem to be portrayed as often as heroes as they are as megalomaniacs. With Hitler's and Stalin's horrible legacies a more recent memory. The view of these men is decidedly and far more consistently dark and loathsome.
What is a hanging chad?
A hanging chad, also called a bulging chad or a pregnant chad, is the scored piece of paper that remains on a punch card ballot if the voter fails to fully punch the card to dislodge the paper. The Chad gained national and international attention in the presidential election of 2000 when the race between Republican candidate George W. Bush, 1946, and Democrat Al Gore, 1948, hinged on the ballot count in Florida. The vote tally in the Sunshine State was so close that manual counting took place in the days following the November 7 election. News photos showed counters holding punch card ballots up to the light to try to determine if a voter had meant to poke a Chad through, thereby indicating a vote. But Florida was not the first state where a disputed election came down to ballot inspection to try to determine voter intent. In 1996, a Democratic primary for a House seat in Massachusetts was settled by carefully inspecting ballots and counting those that were merely dimpled by the voter. In support of its decision to scrutinize ballots to determine voter intent, the Massachusetts Supreme Court stated, if the intent of the voter can be determined with reasonable certainty from an inspection of the ballot, effect must be given to that intent and the vote counted. The conclusion was that a voter should not be disqualified for failing to completely express his or her intent. A 1990 case in Illinois and a 1981 case in Indiana also ruled in favor of examining ballots to try to determine what the voter meant to do. In all cases, ballots where no clear intent could be determined were set aside. In 2000, the Florida recount ended with a tally of 2,909,176 votes for Bush and 2,907,451 for Gore. In winning Florida, the national electoral vote swung in Bush's favor. Though Gore won the popular vote with a national total of 51,003,894 votes to Bush's 50,459,211. Bush managed to carry the Electoral College.
How are amendments made to the U.S. Constitution?
There are two paths that proposed amendments can take to become law. The first path is this: an amendment is proposed in Congress, 2/3 of both houses must then approve it. If they do not, then the proposal ends here, if approved in both houses of the U.S. Congress. The proposed amendment is sent to the legislatures, or conventions, of each state of the Union. 3/4 of all the state legislatures must then approve it. By whatever rules each state legislature uses, once 3/4 of the states approve it, the amendment is made. If 3/4 of the states do not approve it, the amendment fails to become law. The second path is this: the legislatures of 2/3 of the states ask for an amendment to be made to the U.S. Constitution. Congress then calls a convention to propose it. Then the proposed amendment becomes a law when it is ratified by the legislatures in 3/4 of the states. While this path has never been taken, it's an important provision nonetheless, since it allows for a popular State-based proposal to be considered.
Who determines whether a law violates the liberties guaranteed by the Bill of Rights?
It is the job of the U.S. Supreme Court to decide whether or not a law impinges upon the liberties listed in or implied by the Bill of Rights, 1791. The difficult task before the Supreme Court justices is in determining what rights are implied. Such questions prompt months of hearings and deliberations before a decision can be reached as to the constitutionality of a contested law. The judicial body makes its determinations based on a majority vote of the 9 justices, 1 Chief Justice and 8 associates. Established as the highest court in the country by Article 3 of the Constitution, the court has ultimate authority in all legal questions that arise pertaining to the Constitution. Called the Court of Last Resorts, the Supreme Court both interprets the acts of Congress, including laws and treaties, and determines the constitutionality of federal and state laws, under the 14th Amendment. The court has upheld that most of the Bill of Rights also applies to state governments.
How many amendments have been made to the U.S. Constitution?
There have been 27 amendments to date. The following list gives brief summaries and the year each became part of the U.S. Constitution. First Amendment through the 10th Amendment, 1791 comprise the Bill of Rights. 11th Amendment, 1798 declares that U.S. federal courts cannot try any case brought against a state by a citizen of another state or country. 12th Amendment, 1804 revised the presidential and vice presidential election rules such that members of the Electoral College, called electors, vote for one person as president and for another as vice president. Prior to the passage of this amendment, the electors simply voted for 2 men. The one receiving more votes became president and the other became vice president. 13th Amendment, 1865 prohibits slavery. Along with Amendments 14 and 15, these are sometimes called the Civil War Amendments. 14th Amendment, 1868. Defines U.S. citizenship and gives all citizens equal protection under the law. This amendment made former slaves citizens of both the United States and the state where they lived. It further forbade states to deny equal rights to any person. 15th Amendment, 1870 states that the right of U.S. citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment was meant to extend suffrage to black men. 16th Amendment, 1913 authorizes a federal income tax. 17th Amendment, 1913 provides for the direct election of senators. Before this passed, state legislatures elected senators to represent them. This amendment gave that power to the people of each state. 18th Amendment, 1919 made prohibition legal. In other words, the manufacture and distribution of alcohol became illegal. 19th Amendment, 1920 grants women the right to vote. 20th Amendment, 1933 also called the Lame Duck Amendment. It changed congressional terms of office and the dates of the presidential inauguration, so that newly elected officials take office closer to election time. 21st Amendment, 1933 repealed Amendment 18 to end prohibition. 22nd Amendment, 1951 limits presidential tenure to 2 terms in office. A president can hold office for no more than 10 years, 2 years as an unelected president, and 2 terms as an elected president. 23rd Amendment, 1961 grants residents of Washington, D.C., the right to vote in presidential elections. 24th Amendment, 1964 outlaws the poll tax in all federal elections and primaries. Some states had used poll taxes as a way of keeping certain populations of voters from casting their ballots. The practice had served to disenfranchise blacks and poor people. 25th Amendment, 1967 provides for procedures to fill the vice presidency and further clarifies presidential succession rules. Upon removal, resignation, or death of the president, the vice president assumes the presidency. If a vice president is removed, resigns, or dies while in office, the president nominates a vice president who takes office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. 26th Amendment, 1971 lowers the voting age for federal and state elections to 18. 27th Amendment, 1992 prevents Congress from passing immediate salary increases for itself. It requires that salary changes passed by Congress cannot take effect until after the next congressional election. This amendment had been passed by Congress in 1788 and was then sent to the states for ratification. Since the amendment had no time limit for ratification, it became part of the Constitution in 1992. After Michigan became the 38th state to ratify it.
What was the Tang dynasty?
The Tang, 617 to 907, was the 6th to last Chinese dynasty. It's well known since the period saw great achievements not only in government and business, but in letters and the arts, principally lyrical poetry, formal prose, painting, sculpture, and porcelain pottery. The first published book, the Diamond Sutra, was produced during this time, in 868. Considered a golden age of Chinese civilization, the Tang was also an age of great expansion. At its height, the empire stretched from Turkmenistan in the west to Korea, which was a vassal state, in the east, and from Manchuria to northern India. As a result, trade prospered, with Chinese jade, porcelain, silk, rice, spices, and teas exported to India, the Middle East, and Europe. One historian called the Tang the consummate Chinese dynasty, formidable, influential, and innovative. One of the Tang's innovations was the balance of administrative power. Government was separated into three main branches. The Imperial Secretariat, which organized the emperor's directives into policies. The Imperial Chancellery, which reviewed the policies and monitored bureaucracy, and the Department of State's Affairs, which carried out the policies through the administration of 6 ministries. Add to this triumvirate a board of censors, which ensured that corruption was kept to a minimum. This form of government outlasted the Tang dynasty. Subsequent monarchies perpetuated the system into the 20th century. Yet another example of the forward thinking of the Tang dynasty was a civil service. Candidates for public service were trained in the Confucian principles. Before they took an exam that would qualify them for official duty.
Was King Tut the greatest ruler of ancient Egypt?
No, in fact, King Tut's reign was relatively unimportant in the vast history of ancient Egypt. A ruler of the 18th dynasty, Tutankhamun, c. 1370 to 1352 BC, was in power from age 9, 1361 BC. Until his death at the age of 18, a 9-year period that would be of little significance were it not for the November 1922 discovery of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings near ancient Thebes, present-day Luxor. Of the 27 pharaohs buried near Thebes, only the tomb of the minor king, Tutankhamun, was spared looting through the ages. Having not been opened since ancient times, the tomb still contained its treasures. In the antechamber, English archaeologist Howard Carter, 1873 to 1939, found more than 600 artifacts, including funerary bouquets, sandals, robes, cups and jars, a painted casket, life-size wooden statues of Tutankhamun, animal-sided couches, remnants of chariots, and a golden throne. In the burial chambers, a team of archaeologists discovered 4 golden shrines and the golden coffin, containing the royal mummy of Tutankhamun, complete with a golden mask covering his head and shoulders. Earlier in his career, Carter had discovered the tombs of King Tut's predecessors. Queen Hatshepsut, c. 1520 c. 1468 BC, and King Thutmose IV, d. 1417 BC, both of whom were also rulers during Egypt's 18th dynasty.
Why was the Bill of Rights added to the U.S. Constitution?
The United States Constitution, ratified in 1788, contained few personal guarantees. In fact, initially there was some opposition to the new constitution, much of it based on the lack of specific guarantees of individual rights. It was the father of the Constitution and future President of the United States, James Madison. 1751 to 1836, then a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, who in December 1791 led Congress to adopt the 10 constitutional amendments that became known as the Bill of Rights. Most of the rights focus on individual liberties that had been cited in the Declaration of Independence as having been violated by the British. Most of these specific grievances had not been addressed by the Constitution. Therefore, the Bill of Rights was added to cover this ground.
Did all Southern lawmakers leave Washington once the South seceded?
All but one, even after the South seceded and the first shot of the war was fired at Fort Sumter. South Carolina, Senator Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, of Tennessee opted not to leave the Union. The fact that Johnson did not stick with the state he represented may seem a surprising move, but it reveals one of his most fundamental and fiercely held beliefs. He maintained an unswerving trust in the Constitution. Consequently, he viewed secession as not only treasonous but illegal. His decision to remain with the Union proved politically advantageous to Johnson, a Democrat. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, appointed him military governor of Tennessee. When Abraham Lincoln went on to a second term in office, in March 1865, Johnson was his vice president. He had held this job for a scant 6 weeks when Lincoln was assassinated. April 14, and Johnson assumed the presidency.
How many U.S. presidents have been assassinated?
Four American presidents were assassinated in office: Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, was shot on the evening of April 14, 1865, as he sat in the presidential box of Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., watching a performance of Our American Cousin. The man who fired the shot was actor John Wilkes Booth, 1838 to 1865. Who then jumped onto the stage, fell, breaking a leg, and limped away, calling out, "Sic semper tyrannis," a Latin phrase meaning "thus always to tyrants." The president lived through the night, attended by family. He died just after 7 a.m. On April 15. He was succeeded in office by Vice President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875. On April 26 the search party found Booth in a Virginia barn, where he was fatally shot. James Garfield, 1831 to 1881, was en route to a class reunion at Williams College, Williamstown, Massachusetts, on July 2, 1881, when his assailant fired 2 shots at him in a Washington, D.C. train station. The shooter was Charles J. Guiteau, 1841–1882, who held a grudge against the president. One of Guiteau's bullets had only grazed the president. The other was fixed in his back, and doctors were unable to locate it. Today the president's life might well have been spared, but the medical treatment of the late 1800s, which lacked both the X-ray machine and antiseptics, could not save him. He lived 80 days more, dying at a cottage on the New Jersey shore on September 19. He was succeeded in office by Vice President Chester Arthur, 1830–1886. Guiteau's trial lawyer would later claim that Garfield's assassin was insane. But it was an unsuccessful plea for his life. In 1882 he was convicted and hung. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley, 1843–1901, was attending a reception in Buffalo, New York, where the previous day he had delivered a speech. As he approached a man to shake his hand, the fellow fired 2 shots at McKinley. One bullet delivered only a minor flesh wound, but the other lodged in his stomach. Surgeons operated, but gangrene and infection set in, claiming the president's life the morning of September 14. He was succeeded in office by Vice President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858–1919. The shooter was identified as avowed anarchist Leon F. Cholgaz, 1873–1901, he was tried, convicted, and put to death in 1901. President John F. Kennedy, 1917–1963, accompanied by his wife, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, 1929–1994. Traveled in a motorcade through the streets of Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. They were en route to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president was scheduled to make a lunchtime speech. At 12:30 p.m., shots rang out. The president, who was riding in the back seat of a convertible, was hit in the neck and head. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he died at 1 p.m. The nation's loss was immediately felt. As television and radio stations broadcast the message live that Kennedy had been shot and killed. He was succeeded by Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1908–1973. Who took the oath of office aboard an airplane just after 2:30 p.m. Additionally, there were assassination attempts on the lives of Presidents Andrew Jackson, April 14, 1835, Theodore Roosevelt, October 14, 1912, Franklin D. Roosevelt, February 15, 1933, Harry S. Truman, November 1, 1950, Gerald R. Ford, 2 attempts, both in September 1975, and Ronald Reagan, March 30, 1981. Theodore Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan recovered from their injuries. The others were not injured in the attempts.
Who were the most important rulers of the Roman Empire?
The 500 years of the Roman Empire, 27b. C to AD 476, gave history some of its most noteworthy and most diabolical leaders. The major emperors are names that are familiar to most every student of Western civilization. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Trajan. Marcus Aurelius, Diocletian, and Constantine I, called the Great. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero were the first 5 emperors. A succession covering 75 years of Roman rule. Octavian, 63 B.Ca.D. 14, later known as Augustus, became Roman emperor when, after the assassination of his great-uncle, Julius Caesar. A power struggle ensued and he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra to take the throne. Under Augustus's rule, from 27 BC to AD 14 began the 200 years of the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace. During this time no power emerged that was strong enough to sustain conflict with the Roman army. Consequently, Rome was able to turn its attention to the arts, literature, education, and trade. As second emperor of Rome, Tiberius, 42 B.Ca.D. 37, came under the influence of Roman politician and conspirator Sejanus. AD 31. Tiberius was the adopted son of Emperor Augustus. And though he had been carefully schooled and groomed to take on the leadership role, ultimately he became a tyrannical ruler. The final years of his reign were marked by viciousness and cruelty. Upon Tiberius's death, his nephew Caligula, AD 12-41, ascended the throne. Born Gaius Caesar, he was nicknamed Caligula, meaning little boots. Since he was brought up in military camps and at an early age had been dressed as a soldier. For a short time Caligula ruled with moderation. But not long after he came to power, he fell ill and thereafter exhibited the erratic behavior for which he is well known. Most scholars agree that Caligula must have been crazy. He was murdered in AD 41, and Claudius, also nephew to Tiberius, was then proclaimed emperor. Claudius, 10 B.Ca.D. 54, renewed the expansion of Rome, waging battle with Germany, Syria, and Mauritania, present-day Algeria and Morocco, and conquering half of Britain. Though his administration was reportedly well run, he had his enemies, among them was his niece, Agrippina the Younger, AD 1559, who is believed to have murdered him in 54, after securing her son. Nero, as successor to the throne. In Nero, AD 37-68, the early Roman Empire had perhaps its most despotic ruler. Though his early years in power were marked by the efficient conduct of public affairs. In 59 he had his mother assassinated. She reportedly had tried to rule through her son. And Nero's legacy from that point forward is one of ruthless behavior. He was involved in murder plots, ordered the deaths of many Romans, instituted the persecution of Christians, and led an extravagant lifestyle that emptied the public coffers. He was declared a public enemy by the Roman Senate and in the year 68 took his own life. With the exception of Augustus, the 1st century AD of the Roman Empire was marked by extreme rulers. The 2nd century AD was marked by the leadership of soldiers and statesmen. Trajan, 53 to 117, who ruled from the year 98 until his death 19 years later, is best known for his military campaigns, which expanded Rome's territory. He was also a builder, constructing bridges, roads, and many buildings. When Marcus Aurelius, 121 to 80, ascended to emperor in 161, he had already been in public office for more than 20 years. A man of great experience, he was reportedly both learned and of gentle character. His generals put down revolting tribes, and, in addition to winning victories along the Danube River, his troops also fought barbarians in the north.
Why did some observers draw comparisons between the war in Iraq and the Vietnam War?
Critics of the U.S.-led war in Iraq found several similarities to American military involvement in Vietnam. Both conflicts seemed to many people to be without ample cause. Critics of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq charged that there was no compelling reason for Americans to go to war in the Middle Eastern nation. They called the operation hawkish, saying it was an unwarranted expansion of the war on terror. These arguments were strengthened when no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. Media images of protests against the invasion of Iraq harkened back to the anti-war demonstrations of the Vietnam era. And, like Vietnam, there seemed to be no clear exit strategy for the U.S. military from Iraq. These were extended operations, or wars without end. Some observers also drew comparisons between Vietnam's My Lai massacre and the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq. They pointed to military spokespersons who categorized the atrocities as isolated events, unrepresentative of American military policy. The Bush administration stood by the decision to enter Iraq, ousting and capturing Saddam Hussein, 1937. Saying it was a rogue state led by a despotic ruler who had the capability of aiding terrorist groups. The controversy over Iraq continued long after President George W. Bush, 1946, declared the end to major combat operations, as the casualty count climbed, the result of continued coalition fighting against pockets of resistance and attacks on U.S. installments in the unstable nation. In 2005, as U.S. officials slowly handed over security to Iraqi forces, there was not yet a timetable for U.S. withdrawal. But the newly elected interim president, Kurdish leader Jalal Talabani, vowed that his government would work to provide security so that U.S.-led coalition forces could return home.
Was the Holocaust directed by the German government?
Yes. When fervent nationalist Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945, rose to power in Germany in 1933, he quickly established A reign of terror based on his philosophy that the German, Aryan, race is superior to all others. He established a violent policy against Jews, those who did not flee the country were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, where they were kept without cause. This was before Hitler's acts of military aggression in Europe. But after German troops invaded Poland and World War II began, the Führer's anti-Semitic campaign was accelerated. Jews in Germany and in Nazi-occupied countries of Europe were severely persecuted. Those who were put into concentration camps including Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, and Dachau were exterminated, many of them in gas chambers. By the end of the war, in 1945, Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question had been underway for some 12 years. And 6 million Jews had been systematically murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust, or Shoah, Hebrew. As his defeat was imminent, the despotic ruler took his own life in 1945. By then he had destroyed Europe's Jewish community. Many of Hitler's leaders were later tried by an international court at Nuremberg.
What was the Iran-Contra affair?
It was a series of actions on the part of U.S. federal government officials, which came to light in November 1986. The discoveries had the immediate effect of hurting President Ronald Reagan, 1911 to 2004, whose policy of anti-terrorism had been undermined by activities initiated from his own executive office. Following in-depth hearings and investigations into who knew what, when, Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, 1912, submitted his report on January 18, 1994. Stating that the dealings with Iran and with the Contra rebels in Nicaragua had violated United States policy and law. The tangled string of events involved Reagan's national security advisors Robert McFarlane, 1937, and Admiral John Poindexter, 1936, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, 1943. Poindexter's military aid, the Iranian government, and Nicaraguan rebels. The U.S. officials evidently had begun their dealings with both the Iranian government and the Nicaraguan rebels with the goal of freeing 7 Americans who were held hostage by Iranian-backed rebels in Lebanon. President Reagan had met with the families of the captives and was naturally concerned about the hostage situation. Under pressure to work to free the hostages, McFarlane, Poindexter, and North arranged to sell an estimated $30 million in spare parts and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran, then at war with neighboring Iraq. In return, the Iranian government would put pressure on the terrorist groups to release the Americans. Profits from the arms sale to Iran were then diverted by Lieutenant North to the Contras in Central America who were fighting the dictatorial Nicaraguan government. Congress had already passed laws that prohibited U.S. government aid to the Nicaraguan rebels. The diversion of funds certainly appeared to violate those laws. The Iran-Contra affair led to North's dismissal and to Poindexter's resignation. Both men were prosecuted, though the hostages were freed. Reagan's public image was seriously damaged by how the release had been achieved. During the Iran-Contra hearings in 1987, National Security Commission officials revealed that they had been willing to take the risk of providing arms to Iran in exchange for the safe release of the hostages, because they all remembered the U.S. government's failed attempt in 1980 to rescue hostages held at the American embassy in Tehran, Iran. Nevertheless, the deal with Iran had supplied a hostile country with American arms that could then be used against the United States. In 1987, Iran did launch an offensive when it attacked Kuwaiti oil tankers that were registered as American and laid mines in the Persian Gulf. The United States responded by sending in the Navy, which attacked Iranian patrol boats. During this military initiative, the U.S. Navy accidentally shot down a civilian passenger jet, killing everyone on board.
Why was Julius Caesar murdered?
The Roman general and statesman Julius Caesar, 100–44 B.C., was stabbed to death in the Senate House by a group of men, including some of his former friends, who viewed him as an ambitious tyrant and a threat to the Roman Republic. The date of the assassination, March 15, fell into relatively common usage thanks to William Shakespeare's tragedy Julius Caesar, written in the late 1590s, which has a soothsayer warning the Roman general to beware the Ides of March. After Caesar's death in 44 BC, a triumvirate was formed to rule Rome, with Lepidus, Octavian, who would in 27 BC become Augustus, the Roman Empire's first ruler, and Mark Antony sharing power. It was Mark Antony, c. 83–30 BC, of Antony and Cleopatra of fame, who aroused the mobs against Caesar's conspirators, driving them out of Rome. The events illustrate the controversy about Julius Caesar. While some clearly viewed him as a demagogue who forced his way into power, others considered the patrician-born Caesar a man of noble character who defended the rights of the people in an oligarchic state where the government was controlled by a few people who had only their own interests in mind. This divided opinion has followed Caesar throughout history. While opinion is still divided on what kind of a ruler Caesar was, there can be no denying his contributions both to Rome, which would soon emerge as the Roman Empire, and to modern civilization. In his battles, Caesar brought the provinces of Italy under control and defeated his former co-ruler, Pompey the Great, who had, along with Caesar and Crassus, formed the first triumvirate, effectively ending the oligarchy that had ruled Rome. In so doing, he had succeeded in ending the disorder that had plagued Rome for decades and laid the groundwork for the formation of the empire under his grandnephew Augustus in 27 BC. While Caesar was in office, he planned and carried out several reforms, not the least of which was the implementation of the Julian calendar, which he introduced in 46 BC. The Gregorian calendar we use today evolved from it. Caesar also left a legacy of literature. He penned a total of 10 books on his battles in Gaul. C. 58 to 50 BC, and on the Civil War, which he had more or less started in 49 BC. These clear commentaries are still considered masterpieces of military history.